Welcome to Conversation on Value, a podcast on Traces and Dreams about reframing value in business and society. I'm your host, Valeria Maltoni. In this episode, we'll explore the question of value and emotion with social and cultural psychologist Batja Mesquita, who's professor of psychology at the University of Leuven in Belgium. Conversation on Value is a podcast about how to reframe value in business and society. I'm Valeria, and I've been working on the question of value for more than 20 years. Welcome to the podcast. How are you feeling today?
I'm feeling good, Valeria, because I'm with you in the studio.
Good. So that answer brings me back to the concept of your book, which is, part of your research and part of why I wanted to have you here to talk about value and emotion. You talk about how emotion happens between people, how it's the relationship and the context that creates the value. I would love to learn more about that.
Yeah, so the way I and other people see emotions is, I think, less as, this thing that is in your head or this feeling in your head, and more as something that people do within the relationships to achieve certain relationship goals. So just an example, why I say I'm doing well is just as much because that's my feeling as it is because it will increase our connection, right? If suppose I said something else, so I'm saying this whole situation is a good one. I'm gonna support the going well of the interview. And similarly, if I get angry, it's not this boiling feeling inside me, but it's mostly telling you what your boundaries are. I mean, not you specifically, but the person I'm angry at. So I think that when we look at emotions this way, we can ask ourselves, what is it actually that we are trying to do in this situation or in this relationship? And I think that's a very helpful for everybody. This is a very helpful exercise to see, how do I position myself by having this emotion, right? If I'm angry at my partner, then I position myself very differently than if I feel bad or am sad. Angry tells the partner that I am, to some extent, in power and that I'm not going to accept it. And sad tells the partner that I mind, but it doesn't tell the partner that I'm going to do something to them when they keep at their behavior. So I think it's very important to say, not just as communications, but what people do when they become angry or ashamed or sad is actually a social act, an act in our social relationships and interactions.
So you talked about positioning in a relationship, which is something that we typically don't think about. But it's a natural thing of beings in a social. Now, is this culture dependent? Did you find that in your research?
What is culture dependent is what kind of positioning is valued. So I think that people everywhere in the world have, what kinds of position can you take with, of course, with a lot of complexity of meaning, but I can move myself closer to you. I can take distance. I can move myself in a position of power, which obviously I often do when I take the anger option. I can submit myself. So those are things that I don't think those are the options, the logical options of positioning yourself vis-a-vis others. But I do think there are big differences between cultures and, not only national cultures, but also, what some people call subcultures, but religions, positions, gender cultures in what we value. So, for example, for a long time, and even still, it was much more acceptable for men to be angry than for women. So women were expected to, if not like it, at least adjust to it, and men were not. And so in those systematic differences, you also see that it's not just random what emotions people have, but that it's really emotions that fit with their or the culture's goals. And often the two are overlapping, of course. Yeah.
I was reading a book and I was thinking about this concept of emotion as a relational thing. And I was reading a book about transitions. I don't know if you know William Bridges and his work on transitions. And one of the things that he says, which is also, I think that you mentioned, he talks about emotions of the system. So we're used to, especially in Western society, to think about individuals and focus a lot on individuals. And we rarely think about the family or the community as a system where things happen. So the system creates a context. I would love to learn more about anything you found in your research that relates to that.
Yeah, I find a lot of things that relate to it. I think that, people cultivate their own and each other's emotions in a way that fits with the system. That's one way. Systems have norms, emotion norms. They also have positions, right? In the system, it's, to be very simple, in the system, there is an emotion norm for parents and there is an emotion norm for children. And it's actually interesting because I'm Dutch originally, and I raised my children for at least for half of their lives in the United States. And, this is also mixed in with language, but I told my kid at some point, "You're a brat." And, I'm just translating this. It's not a. And so, at some other time, he said to me, "Mom, you're a brat." And, I, of course, without the context, he could never have inferred that that's something that a parent says or an authority person says to a child, but not the other way around. So I think that we constantly make meaning within the context of a larger system, where we can infer what those meanings are. And the same with emotions, of course. You cannot know that anger is or is not, beholden to people with status without seeing the whole culture. So I think in that sense, emotions are always off the system. Emotions are also off the system because we have concepts that we share with people who speak the language. So when I say angry in English, that relies on what the English-speaking community or the English-speaking community as I know it means by anger. So what instances count towards anger and what instances don't count towards anger. So I'm using this conceptual system that is shared across people, and that I draw from, where I draw not only on my own observations and experiences, but also on the observations and experiences as I know them to exist for other people. So in that sense, we have emotions that are very much contextualized by the language and the people with whom we interact and that we use. And then there is another way of where emotions can be part of the system that I don't study so much, but that other people have studied, which is I can, of course, have emotions as a member of the group. So, I can be angry because I'm a liberal woman in America, and abortion rights have just been taken from us, right? So it's a shared concern, but it's also the concern of a group. I can be sad because my sports team has just lost, or really proud because my sports team has just played well. So in many ways, we are how we engage the world is not as individuals, but as groups, as members of groups. So I think that's a way in which emotions are a part of the system. And then the fourth way, maybe, in which emotions are part of the system is that we almost never, I mean, I don't say never, but we almost never do emotions purely by ourselves. We in 90% of when people report emotions, they are actually with other people. And other people's responses to our emotions very much determine how those emotions evolve, right? If I get angry at my husband and he says, "Oh, you're right," my anger is going to take a completely different trajectory than if I'm angry and my husband says, "You are angry. I'm the one who should be, who should be angry here." And, or if somebody says, "You dare to be angry under those circumstances or with this in this position? Shame on you." So it's so in that sense too, I think emotions are part of a community that allows and reinforces some emotions and expressions and encourages some ways for the emotion to evolve and discourages or frustrates other ways. So in all those different ways, I can see, I don't actually know the author that you mentioned, and I don't know how he defines it, but I can see many ways in which emotions are social properties or shared with an environment. Yes.
So one thing that fascinated me in your book, you chose very specific emotions to look at and look at the differences in different cultures based on what is valued in that culture and how those emotions take place. And I wanted to take a minute to explore the contours of shame and anger, because they're strong emotions, I would wager, in many parts of the world, but they show up differently.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they do. There are many ways in which they are different. And as I said, I think all the facets that I just told you about that are social can also vary. So, the most salient difference between culture is whether that emotion, whether the group or the category of emotions is considered good or bad. I call it right and wrong, or wrong in the book. So in the cultures that I grew up in, the Netherlands and the US, anger was actually, nobody would say that they like anger, but it was actually kind of well looked upon in the sense of, you assert yourself, you make clear what is important to you. You have agency in the emotion of anger. So that's all is a good thing. And when we look at the child raising literature, we see that, there's no parent who really encourages anger, like, yeah, you're angry, that's good, or be angry. But you see large differences in how anger is treated. So as something that is, for example, unavoidable, and that is a matter of the child's own character, and that's how many Western cultures perceive it. Or as something that, that shouldn't be there and that is immature. And I haven't talked about the cultures that don't value anger, but there are many of those, actually. There are many cultures in which anger is thought to be immature and bad for the relationship. So you don't get anger, you avoid it, or you suppress it if you need to, but you're not angry. And actually what you see in a lot of those cultures is that people hardly get angry anymore, because they perceive the situation, they give meaning, they make meaning of situations in a different way. And as I said, there are many ways of taking, I'm not saying that people intentionally choose a position in their environment, but there are many positions to choose from. And so if you, as let's say, as a Victorian woman, don't like what your husband is doing, you may not get angry still, because it is your role to accommodate him. So the whole meaning-making system can differ, and that may make anger a prevalent or a not so prevalent emotion. Now, what I describe in the book is with angry, that depending on what it means in a culture, that other people respond differently to you. So in the case of parents and children, German parents or some US parents said that they would take the child very seriously. So basically, they reward the behavior, right? Or they take it seriously in the sense of finding it very annoying. If you look at cultures where people don't want their children to be angry, children get ignored when they get soothed. They don't get anything they want, but nobody understands them, and nobody tries to see an intention in that. So those children just don't know any better, or they're completely ignored when they're angry, and that is certainly very different from what we see in Western cultures. And that I imagine is not only true for children, right? You can be angry and be completely ignored, or you can be angry and not everybody says, so what would you have wanted, or actually yield to your wishes. So there's quite a bit of research that in Western context, and especially for men, I should say, that when men are angry, that they're given status and that they're yielded to. And so it works. Everybody, nobody fights it. People actually give in to take it seriously, the message that they want accepted, and they yield to it. So that for anger, I think shame is a slightly different story, although the beginning of that story is no different. It's that shame in some cultures is good in the sense that it shows others that you're willing to obey to the norms, that you're aware that you may not have conformed to those norms, and that you care that other people are going to accept you. Yeah, right? That's kind of the basis of shame. Now, what's different across cultures, there are several things that are different across cultures, but the first thing that is different across cultures is shame a good or a bad property if the person has it? And I would say, especially in the US, shame, there is not much good about shame. I mean, shame leads to all kind of mental health problems. It's not seen as, person is not strong. It's certainly something to overcome or avoid. You try at all costs to avoid shaming another person. That's very important if you want to give this. So mothers do everything to avoid their children to feeling ashamed, because that's bad for their self-esteem. Well, there are cultures where shame in a child is actually valued, where they think that a child who grows up well is a child that knows shame. So there are these Taiwanese or Chinese mothers who say that what they really are afraid of is that their child won't know shame. So it's that they're shameless and not that they're shameful. But when you look into what shame is, then it certainly has this basis of I want to be accepted, and I want to meet or conform to the norms, and I'm aware that I might be out of my role a little bit. But there it is that if a child, for example, shows shame, that means that they know the norm and the proper hierarchy, and that's a well-behaved child, basically. And so then the parents who are responsible for the children are very proud, if you may say that, feel very good about the fact that their children showed shame, because that means that they raised them to be good people. It also means that the consequences of being ashamed is very different. So a child who is ashamed in, say, Taiwanese families, they are sure to be accepted afterwards. That's a condition to being accepted. A child who feels ashamed in a a Western context is more likely to be, to feel that they don't have what it takes, so to say, that they don't have the self-esteem. And the funny thing I wanted to tell you is that the Chinese mothers in Japan, in that study that I refer to, they didn't really know what was meant by self-esteem or by self-worth. They knew what arrogance was, but they didn't really know what it meant that a child had a good self-image or self-esteem. So you see these very different values that come with shame and pride. What I also say is, if I'm making it a little bit simpler, the shame story, because there's also a whole shame story in honors cultures. That's I'm happy to talk about that later. But for now, I think it's good to know that people will avoid different emotions. So in some cultures, people avoid to make each other angry, and in other cultures, people will avoid making each other ashamed. They will more readily see or appraise or make meaning in a way that makes them anger or in the opposite case ashamed. But also other people will respond to it very differently. And so the whole episode, as I call it in the book, is a different one. So if I'm angry here, there are many different episodes that could be described as an episode of anger. But I would say that set of episodes is very different than the set of episodes in cultures where anger is a really bad emotion, and the opposite for shame. They are translated into each other because they have something in common. And what I would say what they have in common is the intention of positioning yourself in a certain way. So you could say up and down in the case of anger and shame, respectively. But from there on, it's very different. And the ideas and the connotations associated with the feeling are very different. The way a feeling like that plays out in a social interaction is very different. And so there is a point where you say, how similar is that anger in the culture that values it and that sees it as a way of asserting your individuality, versus anger in a culture where that's held against you because you're not protecting the harmony in the relationships. And what I argue there is that it's just different sets of episodes, maybe with a little bit overlap, but really quite different in experience, but also in the predictions about what happens socially, what you will do next, all of the things, the consequences of emotions.
As you were talking about these concepts in different cultures, I was thinking, what did global travel and globalism do to some of these boundaries or some of these distinctions that we have in different cultures, if anything? Because you've talked about speaking with Chinese in Japan, or with different cultures or different people coming from different cultures and living in a new context.
Mm-hmm. There is no easy answer to that question. It's a very complex question that we're also still really studying. But what we see from what we know now is that both that you can go to another culture, you can learn another language, and unless you really are part of the interactions in the other culture, I think what you do is just apply those new labels to the old constructs. So you learn, you can pretty much speak a language and not knowing anything about that culture. So, but that means, and that's also what you find in the bilingual research, that when I came originally from the Netherlands to the United States, I probably had a very Dutch idea of what anger was. And I knew the new label, but I didn't have any experience in what the construct meant in an American or in my American context. That's one answer to the question. That said, people who live in a culture often do come to understand other ways of doing emotions. I'm saying doing emotions because you do them with other people. Just because it's not an all-in-one. On average, the first generation immigrants is still very much in some measurement, but very much emotionally similar to the heritage culture. But as the generations go on, they become closer and closer to majority cultures in the third generation. So that means that both of your grandparents came to the new country, right? So your parents were already born in the new culture. Well, if your parents are both born in the new culture, you are indistinguishable in emotions from the majority. So, but it means that, it's more than one generation that it takes. Now, having said that, when people have a lot of interactions and mostly friends in another group, in the new cultural group, they are adjusting to their emotions, and they're adjusting multiple ways. So we have the first evidence that majority people can also adjust to the minority patterns if they're exposed well enough and if the minority norms are clear enough. So in principle, you can say that this positioning, if emotions is a kind of positioning, then over time and with exposure, people start positioning themselves in comparable ways. But it takes a long time. And it really, I would say, is a matter of learning to do relationships in another way. It's also, I heard one of your previous guests talk about it. We're also studying and have some evidence that people can have different ways of responding emotionally. So that, when I go to the Netherlands, I'm more Dutch than, emotionally Dutch. That means blunt and saying more negative emotions than when I talk to people or when I am in an American context. So the answer is complex, and we don't know everything about it. Are people who have been exposed to two cultures, can they go back and forth? Well, we have some evidence that some do, and that on the whole, probably people do that somewhat. But we don't know, for example, is there a whole group of people who are neither Dutch nor American? So are they a little bit in between? You never fully become American, but you also are not Dutch anymore. And I would say that each of them is possible. And we just don't know to what extent and under what circumstances people do one or the other.
I was thinking I'm an in-between. I am very much Italian here in the US, but I am very American in Italy. I'm much more direct than the Italian everyday culture, which is more running around things, describing things instead of going directly to them. So which brings me to the distinction between feeling and behavior, and how emotions, at least in my understanding of your research and work, are very much tied to behaviors. And you said about we do emotions, so it's something that we emote, that we put out there.
I have to say, there's not an easy relationship to the categorizing of what you experience as an emotion and behavior, of course. And I think, mostly, I think the way we see, we interpret the world, which is, how we feel, also means something for our behavior. Now, it's possible that under certain circumstances, we decide to not express that, right? For example, because it's dangerous or because you have. But we also know that it's possible, and we don't really know to what extent people do that, to say, this is how I should feel or should behave, and to work backwards from what is expected to what you feel. And usually Westerners don't think about their emotions that way, but many other cultures do. And I wonder if we don't still do it. I have a very particular, and this is actually one of the main sociologists working on emotions and emotional regulation. She calls it emotional labor, is Arlie Hochschild. And she describes the costs of flight attendants and how they need to modify their feelings to be always positive and friendly, and how they do work to feel as they should feel in their daily work. But she also writes in a chapter that's much less cited, that maybe some of our roles are so clear that we already have feeling roles for ourselves. So, for example, I find that a very convincing example, actually. For my kids, I have certain expectations from myself, how I should feel. And I've never experienced trouble with meeting those expectations. In the sense, have I never been angry when I didn't want to? I can't say that. But, in general, my feelings are much more accepting, much more measured, much more instructive for them and supportive than they would be with any adults. And so isn't that a way of emotion, of having your emotions in a way that fits the roles that you have at that point? I think you do. You do find, I have the same with my students. I may be annoyed when a colleague doesn't understand it right away, but with my student, my role is raising them and teaching them and being patient. So there is a certain expectation that you will have the feelings that fit your role, and that you don't just start yelling at your students for not understanding something, right? There is not, so you just don't let it come to the point where your interpretation of that situation is so different from what you're supposed to feel. So I think that a lot of times our interpretations of what's going on fit the demands of the environment, but of course not always, and also in different cultures, maybe to different extents. But it's a very hard question. Is it, what I can tell you is that we just did research about couples in Japan and in Belgium. We were originally we wanted to do it in the US too, but it was such a complicated story that we dropped the US for once. But we had them do a conflict discussion in the lab. So we asked them, we said, what do you have a lot of disagreements about? And why don't you try to solve that disagreement in the lab? And so we had them talk to each other in the lab, and we found many emotions. And we found that when we had them report what they felt, and we did that in a particular way, we had them watch the tape of themselves discussing that disagreement. And we stopped the tape and we said, what did you feel then? And what did you feel then? What did you feel then? But then we also observed their emotional behaviors. So we carefully coded, continuous behavioral data. And the cultural differences we find when we look at the self-report data are very similar to the cultural differences we find in the behavior data. So Japanese have a lot of empathy and they try to maintain the harmony. I mean, of course, there is some anger also, but very little compared to Belgians. And for Belgians, it's the other way around. And we find that in the self-report, we also find it in the behavioral data. So, how is it always, are they always related? No. Do people sometimes have work to do to either feel like they behave or to behave like they feel? Yes, probably. Is there sometimes, do we think there is sometimes even a suppression of an impulse that was there? Yes, there can be. But I think on the whole, our feelings and our behaviors are somewhat associated. But, having said that, of course, your behaviors are also just limited by what you can do, right? You can feel angry, but you cannot hope to win a physical fight with a person who is much larger. But what I would argue is that knowing that also probably makes you look at that situation a little bit differently, because there is nothing that you can demand or not accept. So Would it be anger or?
So it sounds to me like the story we have in our head about the way things should be has a conversation with the context, right? And the situation that determines what could be.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Your feelings, of course, have something to do with what you see the situation affords you.
So in talking about story, there's another section of the book that was really engaging for me, and that was the conversation or the part around how love and happiness have become such prevalent concepts, especially in the West, almost to the point where you can talk about an invention or a story around love and happiness centered around ideas like well-being and how there's value associated with that. I would love for you to, give us a little bit of a primer on that.
Yeah. So I think people in all cultures want to have a good life, right? It's something they aspire to, but what that means can be very different across cultures. And actually, we are just publishing a book that is more for a little bit more for a scientific audience, but that is called Against Happiness. And that's a provocative title. I'm not against happiness, but where we try to say that, people don't have to be happy in order to have a meaningful life. And no, I always have had this example in mind with my parents were Jewish. And so during they were children during the Holocaust. And so they had been saved basically by people in the resistance during the German occupation. So, I always had this idea of the people in the resistance, that they woke up and thought, what would be a good day? They didn't think, let's see how I can be most happy. They thought, let I see how I can resist best, or what is on the agenda now, right? And when you look at people whom we would say have a good life, people like Gandhi and Mandela, you wouldn't say that those people were happy necessarily, or even pursuing happiness. Mandela spent a good part of his life in a miserable prison, but his life was meaningful by all means. So I think the obsession with being happy is a very modern invention. Also, maybe an invention of one of my colleagues did research on how the term happiness was used it's actually really interesting research on the State of the Union addresses throughout history. And only around, I think, 1960, the colleague is Shige Oshii, so people can look this up because I'm not sure about the date, but presidents started to use the word happy or happiness first to refer to individuals. Before that, the nation was happy, and also to refer to something good instead of the absence of bad. And so this idea that we have to be, all happy, and that it has to be this excited happiness, the individual happiness, is a very, very modern idea that is also not shared across cultures. So my colleague, so it's not shared across times, is the story of the State of the Union. It's also not shared across cultures. I have a colleague, Jeannie Tsai, who does research on what types of good feelings people value. And so she finds that European Americans really value the excited happiness. I bet you that Italians are among those. I've lived there. But that actually Asian Americans and Asians much more value calm. And so you can say the absence of anything that is too activating is much more of a goal than the presence of good, exciting things. And if you turn that around, if you look at when people have depression, for example, it's for European Americans, it's when they do not have enough of the excited kind of happiness. But for Asian Americans, it is more when they don't have enough calm. So I'm not saying that people don't want to have a good life, but a good life doesn't always mean to be happy in the sense that primarily Americans, but then I think a lot of Western Europeans too define this happiness. And so what it means to feel good is very different.
So it's interesting when you talked about Italians, I was thinking about it because from a linguistic standpoint, if we look at expressions, like when I came to the US, I was surprised, people, how you doing? And people actually didn't want to know how I was really doing.
Yeah.
It was a cordial, I acknowledge you as a human being. We're crossing paths and I acknowledge you. And American language does have a lot of enthusiastic terms like great, fantastic. Everything is large and very expansive. Well, I think about when you ask an Italian how they're doing, it's typically not bad. So it's more closed as language. And it's almost like I don't want to bring anything bad upon myself by being too expansive. So there is a cultural nuance there, I think, that is interesting. Yeah.
But it's also an historical nuance, because if I see the research on the State of the Union, I think that was pretty much what happy meant. What is it in the meantime, 60 years ago. So there are different meanings to happy, and not necessarily, I don't know what we would say in the Netherlands. I just don't think people would say, they would say something like, okay, I'm fine. Or, but it's not the default anyway. Our book Against Happiness goes beyond that. It also says, well, just how happy people think they are, even in an American context, doesn't really always mean how good they have it. So you find some groups who report really high subjective well-being, high happiness, but where suicide rates are really high or mental health problems are really high. And so then the question is, what does it actually tell you about their well-being that they say they're happy? So it's in part against happiness as the single measure for a good life. There are many more measures. But so that I think that is one of the things that I say about happiness. There are also many cultures where happiness in general is just not something to strive for. I mean, very many cultures, and probably many times, right? I also think Ukrainians in that at this time don't wake up and think, what is going to make me happy today? They're going to say, what can I do today? Or how can I get through the day, but in a meaningful way? So, but I had this Chinese colleagues who said, sleep enough, be healthy, and go to work. And her second generation kids said, and what about, it was Mama Wong's rules. And it was something like this and they said, what about be happy? And she said, oh no, that's not important. And I thought that was a fabulous. You can be happy, but who cares, right? You need to do your work, be healthy, and something else, sleep enough. Yeah. So it's as a goal, as a general goal, it's also not universal by any means.
And the other word, love, which is a concept very much commercialized these days. We just had Valentine's Day a few weeks ago. So that also changes, right?
Yeah, I think it's that also has changed a lot. I think to understand it is that relationships weren't based on love as much. So marital relationships weren't really based on love that much. And parental relationships were also, maternal love was invented in the 19th century, late 19th century. And it coincided, if I can believe the historians on emotions, with the nuclear family. So before that, children had to fear their parents and then God. And that was pretty much the basis of relationships. And the idea was not a relationship of reciprocity or caring, but it was very much the emphasis was on obedience and fitting in the system. And what exactly the reason is that parental relationships changed is, I think, a matter of debate. But one of the things that I can think about is that it became more important when the relationship became more voluntary. So if you are all living on a farm and everybody works together and you just are mutually independent or interdependent, love may not actually be the issue. It may be, do you work enough, or, do you contribute to the whole? When you are in a society where a lot of relationships are based on choice and on, staying around, when the nuclear family is no longer is the form of living and no longer the extended multi-generation households, it may become more important to actually value each other, or to know that it may also be that a child going out in the world in an industrial age need to know more that they're loved or that they have value. So in that sense, you can explain that love becomes important. And in the marriage sector, you can say that instead of an economic agreement, the economic agreement of arranged marriage, of course, there were always personal preferences and how people got along. But I think love in the sense of romantic or sexual love was just not so important, and actually also not so positive. So and even in the 80s, when people did research on emotion words, Chinese students found love in a negative category and not in a positive category. So love was, probably had something to do with sadness because you can't follow your love, or problematic because it could go against your parents' wishes. And it didn't have any of the connotations of love as the best instance of happiness. So it's very different. There are also cultures where love is more connected. The whole word of love is more connected with sadness, because love means that you know the other person's suffering and that you're sympathetic. And there are cultures where love is just not as much at the foreground. There is my colleague Glenn Adam did research in Ghana, and he described how people were very preoccupied not with love, but with hate and enemyship. And people were really worried that their friends took advantage of them and that they had too many friends and not real friends. And so suspicion and hate were much more on the forefront than love and liking. And so this culture that is organized on, love is very much an emotion of the system, to return to that phrase. And it's a focus on the system towards these positive and self-chosen relationships, I think, and possibly egalitarian.
So in terms of system, I was fascinated by how you have a diagram in your book about moving away and towards another human being and how they look emotionally. Can you tell me a little bit more about how you came to that?
Well, I mean, what I try to say is that if you think about the large categories of ways emotions are when something is important is going on, right? Emotions are, you have emotions, I would say, when something out of the habitual happens, and you either need to, it's so exceptionally good that you need to do something to get closer, or to embrace it, or to take advantage of it, or it's so bad, potentially so bad that you need to distance it, stop it. And so my argument with that diagram is really, how many of those ways of thinking that your position towards the environment should change do we have? And they're logical possibilities is what I say. And some are don't move, so everything, probably everything is okay, so that's something like calm or peaceful. Others are approach, you want to approach. Yeah, I think, love is a good example of an emotion where you want to approach. Probably hope also, because you want to come closer to whatever makes you hopeful. Going away could be you go away, or you take distance, or you push those other people away. So I use that diagram to say, why do we think that we have only certain kinds of emotions? Well, because maybe the underlying positioning is similar. If you really look at the highest, I'm saying underlying, I'm not sure that it's underlying, it's inferred positions. But if you want to go very coarse-grained, not fine-grained at all, you say, okay, people can come closer, go away, push away, submit themselves, be dominant. How many other positions can you take? A combination of those. So that's my argument, and it was very much where we started the conversation, where you said, well, how is anger different and how is it similar? What I'm saying is that I think that it's often somewhat similar in the starting position of what relationship, of what positioning it describes. Not even completely, because you can be up and angry while you're completely withdrawing, or while you're commanding or domineering a person. That's possible. But at this highest level, you could say a person who is angry, or anything in that larger category, chooses a position of power frames the situation from a position of power.
I'm glad you talk about framing, because one thing you say in the book that resonated with me is how emotion ties into story in the world, rather than being mental states.
Right. That's what I think they are, stories in the world. And yes, I think, as I said before, at any point, probably a lot of stories are possible, right? About what happens between people. So I would say you choose the story that fits the narrative of your culture, the kind of goals and ideals of your culture, your experiences from the past, your position at that point. I mean, all of those things come into play, and also how you perceive other people's position. So it's a lot of interpretation, and I think interpretation from the point of the individual, but always an individual is always relying on the cultural framework that they're functioning in or by, the language, the social interactions that they're in, or the social relationships. So yeah, with all that information in mind, I think you draw a narrative, and then this narrative also comes with an idea of what are the logical behaviors that go with that. So you start a story, you may even have a name for a story, such as, this is a story of love, or this is a story of anger. But the story itself has, draws on experiences of similar stories where certain things happened in your environment, of course, in the environment that you have experienced. you draw from those experiences to predict what's going to be next and to choose your behaviors. I see emotions very much as spinning a story, not in the sense that they're not real, they're very real. But at each point you can, with your interpretation of what is going on, you also are spinning the narrative of the emotion. And you know, it's important, of course, that you're not doing that by yourself. If you spin a narrative of an emotion that makes no sense to anybody in your environment, you have a problem, because other people won't understand you and won't approve of you. So, you know, somebody who is constantly angry, that won't be a story that, you know, when it's constant, that won't go over well and that doesn't get rewarded. But a well-functioning person in a society or in social relations spins their stories in a way that they resonate with the other people and with which they interact and have relationships. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for your time today. You talked about Against Happiness being a book for academics, but you piqued my interest. So I'll certainly look to see if I can get my hands on it. And for listeners at home, I would love for you to pick up a copy of Between Us, How Culture Creates Emotion. It's a book rich with ideas on how emotions happen in the world. And we very much need to get hold of this kind of narrative in our culture to understand how these mechanisms work.
Thank you very much, Valeria. These were interesting questions. And let me say, it's not just my narrative, the book, it also has a lot of evidence in it. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone. You've been listening and watching a conversation on value. I'm your host, Valeria Maltoni, and I hope you'll join us again for our next conversation on Traces and Dreams.